For the Wild podcast is brought to you in part by the Calliopeia Foundation and listeners like you. Calliopeia supports projects interweaving spirituality, culture, and ecology. We are grateful for their support and the support of grassroots contributions from listeners. To learn more about the Calliopeia Foundation, visit calliopeia.org. To make a donation to For the Wild, visit forthewild.world/donate or support us through Patreon.
Hello and welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. Today I'm speaking with Jackie Wang, a Black Studies scholar, poet, multimedia artist, and assistant professor of culture and media at the New School's Eugene Lang College.
I think we need to address the problem of the system overall. And I think transformative justice and other forms of community accountability and methods of folding people back into communities are important.
Jackie received her PhD in African and African American Studies at Harvard University and was recently a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She is the author of Carceral Capitalism, a book on the racial, economic, political, legal, and technological dimensions of the U.S. carceral state. She has also published a number of punk zines, including On Being Hard Femme and a collection of dream poems titled Tiny Spunklunker, on the Onario Womb. Well, Jackie, thank you so much for joining us in conversation today. Researching for this interview was shocking and really important information that was coming through, so I'm really looking forward to diving into some of these really intense topics with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, Jackie, I'd like to begin by discussing the function of the carceral state amidst late-stage capitalism. In Carceral Capitalism, you specifically cite predatory lending and parasitic governance as areas that we must give our attention to if we want to understand this beast. And I'd like to really focus on what you describe as financial states of exception, which, as I understand it, are instances in which indebted local governments authorize austerity measures while relying on predatory techniques through policing and incarceration to fill revenue gaps. And I'm especially interested in starting at this point because in the past couple of months, we have seen so many states, cities, and towns begin to declare financial deficits in response to the impacts of COVID-19. So can you talk about previous historical instances of predatory behavior during times of debt and what this time might reveal about our immediate future as it relates to the carceral state? Why is it that while state and local governments are already looking to cut early education, senior care, disability services, etc., they're not touching money allocated for incarceration?
Yeah, so this is a really great question and one that is very important to think about in this particular moment. And this is something that I've been thinking about as various stimulus bills are being debated. And the most recent one is geared towards providing money to states and municipalities because we see that the loss in tax revenue and also the cost of managing the coronavirus has forced municipalities and states to go into debt. And in some places, they were already heavily indebted, so it just exacerbated the crisis. So in late May, the Democrats proposed a bill that was geared primarily towards providing funding to states and municipalities. And this is supposed to give them liquidity so they can maintain their operations without having to make substantial cuts to remain solvent. And this is something that the Republicans are very reluctant to pass. So Mitch McConnell actually said, let the states go bankrupt, which actually is not allowed in our bankruptcy code. Municipalities can file for bankruptcy, but states can't. And so this is creating a situation where states and municipalities are going to have to make cuts if the federal government doesn't provide them substantial financial backing. The situation is quite paradoxical because, as someone who believes in investment in the welfare state, in public services, in healthcare, I'm very resistant to the lack of support for municipalities and states. Higher ed, when it comes to state budgets, is often the first area to be slashed. So this is why I think we need to provide funding to local governments. But the paradox is that that money will often go towards expanding prisons and police as opposed to providing social services. So this is no accident. This is kind of how the state has been built since the 70s. So if we want to think more historically about the situation, starting in the late 70s, and this is after there was a financial crisis that began in 1973, stagflation, they call it, or oil shocks, and the money was inflated also. But what happened was there was a simultaneous buildup of the carceral state that came with a reduction in spending for things like disability and anti-poverty programs. Spending for healthcare has increased over time because we have an aging population. Medicare has been expanded, but there's really been dramatic reductions in other areas of the social safety net. And so what I'm worried about in this moment that we're in right now is that when the municipalities and the states are suffering financially, they're just going to resort to extracting from poor people because, politically, Wall Street controls the political apparatus, and it's more convenient for them to squeeze the people on the bottom rather than tax the people on the top. And so this is what happened across the country, and in particular in the Midwest and the South. You saw that in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, municipalities that were struggling financially decided to ramp up ticketing and the use of the courts and the police to extract from residents to fill revenue gaps. So this is something that I'm very concerned about in this moment. And when we think about the kinds of things that are done on the government level during financial crises, what we see happening, and David Harvey kind of begins his story of neoliberal statecraft with the 1975 bankruptcy of New York. But what we see happening is there's austerity that's imposed on residents. So what that means is spending for things like education, anti-poverty programs, healthcare, even money towards public hospitals. All of these areas are cut substantially. And I think that there are actually a lot of activists who are trying to shape how bailout money is spent and make sure that what happens now isn't an instance of what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism.
I'm wondering, is decarceration even a possibility amidst coronavirus? I get the impression that in order to fill revenues, there is a possibility for the police state to increase, but simultaneously, I think that there are also predictions for decarceration by necessity. Is that true? Or what is this sort of decarceration going to look like?
This is a great question, because I think that the way things are going now, I think that there will be a dip in incarceration, but it might not be substantial. So what we saw post 2008, and this crisis is going to be more severe than 2008. But what we saw in the wake of 2008 was a slight dip in the rate of incarceration, and it wasn't across the United States. There were places that didn't experience a decrease in incarceration. Some people who study the political economy of prisons might argue that it's actually cheaper for the government to incarcerate and lean on the criminal legal system to act as a kind of welfare system than directly provide resources to people. I do think that there is a political need to put pressure on states and governments, on them to spend their money not on increasing incarceration, but investing in things like education, for example, K to 12 and higher education. So it's unclear which direction it's going to go in. There are a lot of factors at play. But one thing that I am worried about is the rapid adoption of cheap technologies that could serve as alternatives to incarceration. GPS, ankle monitoring shackles, the use of risk assessment tools, predictive policing tools. These are all tools that are attractive to governments in times of crises because they can reduce spending on things like physically confining people. It's much cheaper for the state to track someone using cheap technology than it is to provide them shelter, healthcare, food, even though the services that are provided in prison are notoriously bad.
I'm curious to talk about the debt economy a little bit further. I think debt is a linchpin in American society, but we don't take the time to examine how it shapes our lives. And of course, there are different degrees and facets. Some of us are born into debt, some are pushed to take on debt in the name of class mobility, and some take on debt in the pursuit of consumer culture. So can you talk a little bit about how the debt economy structures our lives, or the temporality of debt, as well as how debt has become historically racialized, thus posing even further problems to the way in which the criminal justice system operates?
I'm a millennial, so we're part of the debt generation, and debt is so normalized. So one thing that I write about in my book was when I was trying to decide where to go to college to do my undergraduate degree, I was working a job at a grocery store, and I was talking to one of my coworkers, and he was like, "So you're going to take out student loans?" And I was like, "Oh, I think I'm going to go to public school, and I got this scholarship that covers it." He's like, "Oh, but you have to take out student loans. Everyone takes out student loans. That's just a normalized part of how you pursue a college degree, and particularly if you don't have assets or resources or come from a well-off family." And it's been so normalized that in some ways we can't imagine life without it. It even affects how employers compensate and entice employees with benefits. Now there's a shift towards providing student debt relief rather than retirement benefits because people have so much debt when they graduate and enter the workforce. And if we think about, the scaling back of the welfare state, the crushing of the power of labor unions in this country in the 70s and beyond, all of these things have created a system where you increasingly need debt not only to buy property, but even to cover subsistence. So I was reading the financial press and came across an article a few months ago that was saying very recently that the cost of subsistence, so including housing, healthcare, and all of a family's expenses, the cost of subsistence is now higher than the amount of money people make on average per year. And this is calculated by households. And so it's literally the case where for the average person, even covering the cost of subsistence is more money than you have just working and getting a salary. So how is that gap filled is then the question. And increasingly, people use debt, whether it's pay for their car loans or pay for groceries. I am very concerned that rather than directly transferring wealth to people in this moment to help them weather the economic crisis caused by coronavirus, that they'll just encourage us to go into more debt. The idea is that, oh, well, you don't have a job now, so we'll create means for you to borrow money to pay for your groceries and rent. And, when you're back on your feet, then you can pay that money back. And I don't think that that's going to work over the long run. And even mainstream economists would argue that debt is actually dragging down the economy and is going to slow any recovery we could possibly hope for. But just to go back to, because there are a few things that I'm trying to cover all my bases here with the question. But when we think about race and debt, I talk about the racialization of student debt in my book. There's also the racialization of subprime mortgage lending, which was something that was revealed in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. But every area of consumer debt is racialized insofar as debt burdens are not proportionately borne across demographics. So a book that I read recently was Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book, Race for Profit. And in that book, she talks about how when redlining, which was basically a federally sanctioned practice of barring Black people from accessing mortgage loans to buy property. So the way that redlining works was certain neighborhoods were excluded from mortgage lending. These were predominantly Black neighborhoods. And when redlining ended in the 60s, what happened was all of the various interests involved with real estates, from the real estate brokers to the mortgage lenders, all of these actors saw African Americans as a demographic to prey on to generate profits, using the end of redlining to generate those profits through predation. So Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor calls that predatory inclusion, where the idea is, this was the way that the government was pitching it, was that they would foster expanding mortgages to African American home buyers. And ultimately what happened was they sold junk properties that they then repossessed, and they weren't forthcoming about the deep structural problems of the properties that they were selling. They basically were scamming the African American buyers of homes. And I think this is something that we also saw leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, which mortgage lenders were basically preying on Black and Latinx home buyers for predatory loans that would lead to their houses being repossessed.
Terms like the prison industrial complex, mass incarceration, and the likes have gained a tremendous amount of traction lately, but many of us struggle with really pinpointing the economic benefit of prisons. I think when we hear or experience juvenile sentencing laws or are reminded that at any point 70% of people being housed in jails are legally innocent, we're forced to recognize that the system is not intended to rehabilitate or prevent harm. So I know this is a bit of a primer, but can you explain how and where the money is made? Why this isn't just a conversation about private prisons and what many of us are missing when it comes to understanding the economical and political roles in upholding the world's largest prison system?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that in the United States, the way that people understand the nature of the prison problem is through this narrative of private prisons. The majority of prisoners, I think it's something like, I want to say it's like 92% of prisoners are held in public prisons. And so the portion of the prison system that is privately run is quite small relative to the rest of the system. But we have such a huge system, so it is a source of profit for these companies. This focus on private prisons perpetuates this narrative that the cause of mass incarceration was greedy private prison companies, which is not actually the case if we look at the history of the carceral state and the buildup of the prison system. The buildup started long before private prisons even entered the scene. And so when we think about the political economy of prisons, we also need to think about all of the areas of the prison system that are a source of profit outside of just running the prisons. So we can think of the telecommunications services that are provided inside prisons. We can think about the commissary items. We can think about the construction companies that profit from building prisons. We can think about the technology companies that profit from these high-tech forms of surveillance. And we see that private interests are deeply embedded with every part of the prison system. But then we also need to think about the economic side of the public dimension of the prison system. So I have a chapter in my book that talks about municipal fine farming and the political economy of fees and fines. And that's connected to private interests insofar as municipalities are trying to remain solvent by paying off their creditors. But really, they're trying to raise revenue, which is different than capital because they're not investing that money in producing commodities. And so if we look at public finance, we also see the ways in which the expansion of prisons are financially incentivized. One thing that I write about in my book is what we're calling now offender-funded criminal justice, which is becoming increasingly attractive to municipalities that are suffering. But when we also look at, public finance, state entities are trying to make calculations about costs and savings. So they might decide that, well, we could invest in public education, we could invest in, food stamps, Medicaid, these kinds of things. But maybe it's cheaper for them to invest in building prisons. And also, there are other incentive structures set up in different parts of the country. So one thing that I've been thinking about lately in relationship to the bail system is in Louisiana, the bail bonds industry was protected by state legislation that basically ensured that a cut of the money that was made from commercial bail bonds would go to the state, and it would fund the courts and the criminal legal system. And it's a similar situation with the telecom services that are provided inside prisons. Every time a prisoner's family member puts money on their account and they use that money to pay for a phone call to the family and loved ones, what happens is the state will take a cut of the revenue that's raised from that phone call and put it towards funding the prison. So this is basically a system where the jails and prisons get kickbacks from the prison telecommunication companies, and they price gouge prisoners by charging large fees for the use of the phones.
There's so much to take in here. Thank you for explaining this to us in a way that is really detailed. So, yeah, I'm now thinking that for many of us, prisons evoke a very physical understanding. We think about their spatial infrastructure or the containment of bodies in cages, which in turn somewhat obscures the technological dimensions of prisons. And I'm thinking about the corporations that supply prisons with surveillance technology, like Amazon and facial recognition technology, and the sort of precedence that this establishes. As someone whose work focuses on these dimensions, what is digital carceral infrastructure comprised of, and what can it tell us about the state's growing surveillance apparatus and the ways in which technology is poised to be the next frontier in terms of wealth and exploitation?
Yeah, this is a great question, something that I've also been thinking about during the coronavirus crisis, because we've been seeing now that there were certain technologies that the public resisted the adoption of. So I'm thinking of Clearview AI's facial recognition software. There was a huge feature in the New York Times about how hundreds of law enforcement agencies, law enforcement departments across the country were using this facial recognition software that basically would scrape the internet for photos of people on social media. And if someone deleted that profile or changed their privacy setting, all of those pictures, all of that data would stay in Clearview's system. There was no regulation or anything of what data could be held by this private company. And so I think that there was strong resistance, even though police departments did adopt this software and they said, wow, it's so accurate. It's more accurate than the other facial recognition softwares. There was strong public resistance to the adoption of this technology. Now that coronavirus has hit and these technologies are being framed as ways to fight the virus, basically what is happening is the crisis has created an opening for these companies. And all of us have moved our lives online very rapidly. That is, all of us who aren't so-called essential workers. And we're using things like Zoom and other apps to mediate our work and all of our interactions. And the adoption of technologies, both by users, but also by the state for the purpose of fighting the virus, is happening largely uncontested. And this is something that I'm worried about. But one thing I think about in terms of the relationship between prisons and the adoption of these surveillance technologies, I think about the way in which prisoners are used to test these technologies. So you mentioned Amazon and their contracts with police departments, for example. Amazon is developing voice recognition software to analyze things like the accent of the speakers who are using home assistants in their houses. So the prison telecom companies that provide telephone services to prisoners have technology built into the phone system that analyzes the voice of the person using the phone. So allegedly, this is to prevent fraud inside prisons. So what they say they're trying to do is prevent someone from taking a prisoner's PIN number and using another prisoner's account to make a call. When you actually dig into the contracts that these telecom services have with prisons, and if you actually look at their surveillance patents, they're collecting data and creating security products for the prisons. And we can think of basically every dimension of a prisoner's life is being tracked and monitored in some way. So, even prisoners' interactions with people on the outside are perpetually being monitored. And now that all communication is mediated by digital services, even prison messaging services, they're collecting huge reams of data that they're then using to improve their products and further securitize and surveil prisoners.
In Carceral Capitalism, you write about the self-fulfilling nature of a technocratic world wherein algorithms determine future outcomes completely on the past. I believe in the past year, California became the first U.S. state to eliminate cash bail, a move that was praised by liberals, but it was replaced with so-called risk assessment tools that rely on data that is the product of perpetually discriminatory system that's solidifying racial bias and white supremacy under a new, less threatening name. And I see this as probably the most dangerous aspect of it, in that these risk assessment tools are presented as evidence-based, objective technologies, usually pushed during periods of reform as liberal concessions. So can you talk about these predictive algorithms, how objectivity is negating our space to contest, and how we can stop the ascension of predictive policing in our own communities?
Yeah, this is a really, really important question to think about in this particular moment. And I've actually done quite a bit of research on the history of risk assessment and algorithmic policing, and in particularly the domain of bail. So California did recently adopt Senate Bill 10, SB 10, which replaced cash bail with risk assessment, although it hasn't been implemented because the American Bail Coalition organized to have another referendum on the bill to try to crush the bill that was already passed. And so basically what happened in the California context was there was a lot of organizing around reforming the bail system because of how predatory it is and because of how it preys on poor people, and it becomes a source of revenue for bail bond agents and private interests, and also state revenue. So the bail system has, I think, rightfully been contested, and there's been lots of mobilization around getting rid of cash and money bail and the private bail system. But I'm very, very critical of the adoption of risk assessment as a liberal alternative to bail. And I think you're right to point out that the technical dimension of it masks the way in which it's racialized and how it actually just perpetuates racial and class inequality and obscures the way in which it perpetuates these forms of inequality. So risk assessment has actually been around for a very long time, almost 100 years, although it's really only in the post-war period where it's been adopted. But basically, what it does is, and if we look at the risk assessment tools that were created, for example, in the 60s, and they're pretty similar to the ones that are used now, what these tools do is give defendants a risk score based on sociological data about that person. So different factors that could be calculated in one of these tools include employment history, access to stable housing, education, community ties, marital status. These are all things that these tools assume correspond to levels of risk. So if we take the factor of marital status, for example, the tools are designed such that a married person is considered low risk relative to an unmarried person, which we can see how that would discriminate against queer people and people who don't have a normative family structure. Many of the actual empirical evidence supporting these tools is quite questionable to begin with, but I kind of don't want to critique the tools on those terms because I think the big problem with these tools is they don't consider the social determinants of someone's position in society and try to address the things that cause someone to be, for example, socially marginalized. The main problem with these tools is that they punish the most socially marginalized people on the grounds that they're higher risk. And so I think that even the language of high risk and low risk when it comes to the criminal legal system is something that we should contest completely, because that language is about making distinctions between deserving and undeserving people, and thus marking some people as worthy of punishment by the state.
You speak and write about the temporal aspects of incarceration, especially in terms of the toll it takes, how timelessness can be its very own kind of torture, which often goes unrecognized because it is a violence that is not bounded to time or place. For listeners, can you share the temporality of punishment and its racialized dimensions? Is this phenomenon unique to the American prison landscape?
The American prison landscape is unique insofar as our sentencing regime is so dramatically out of step with the rest of the world. I wrote a chapter on juvenile life without parole sentences and mandatory juvenile life without parole. And the US is really singular in that no other country in the world practices these kinds of sentences, or no other country in the world treats juveniles as harshly as the United States does. So when we think about the temporal dimension of the prison system, it's completely tied to this expanded sentencing regime where, for example, someone who's a juvenile lifer, and a lot of people think we don't have juvenile life without parole now, which is not true. We just have discretionary juvenile life without parole. But if we think about what that means, is that we're locking up people before they're even adults and telling them that they have to live their entire adult life in a cage. And that in itself is a kind of torture because that person's temporal horizon is completely defined by the criminal legal system. My work on the use of time as a form of torture was partly informed by some reflections that I made in my book when I think about my brother's situation and how he was incarcerated when we were teenagers, and thinking about how our lives have diverged from that moment, and even the way in which the system is so slow, appeals are so slow. There's a way in which an uncertainty is weaponized against people. And we see this happening over and over again with people who are on death row and have an execution that's scheduled, and at the last minute there'll be a stay and the execution will be stopped, and then the stay will be overturned, and then it'll be rescheduled, and it might be deferred, and then it might not be deferred. And for me, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be in that situation where you have no agency at all over the horizon of your life and what your life is moving towards. I think that there's been a qualitative shift as well in terms of how prisoners are allowed to spend their time. And some people think that mass incarceration was some like neoconservative conspiracy and it was led by the Republican Party. But I think in terms of the main architects of mass incarceration, a lot of the blame should fall on the shoulders of Bill Clinton. And one of the things that he did, in addition to passing his crime bill and perpetuating a law and order policy program, was he dismantled prisoners' access to different forms of programming inside prisons. So prisoners' access to Pell Grants, which they could use to get an education while in prison. The dismantling of Pell Grants for prisoners destroyed prison education, and there's been a lot of effort to find other ways to fund prison education. But that was something that Bill Clinton did, and a lot of the scaling back of programming for prisoners happened under Clinton's administration. So basically what that does is prisoners are subjected to hard time where they have to pass their time in this state of waiting where there are no outlets for meaningful activities. But people still find ways to engage in things like collective education while incarcerated by trying to start covert prison education programs, reading groups, things like this, even just sharing literature inside prisons. I would just like to emphasize that the US is unique in how severe we are with sentencing.
Don't really remember much from the dream. Most of what I remember are landscapes, cityscapes. I must have been in China or somewhere where there were compartmentalized vistas. There was a floor with stacked pagodas on cliffs, and I wandered around
recording. I had left the library on my way to the pagodas. It was like you went through some hallways, labyrinthian hallways.
Well, Jackie, I really want to turn our conversation in the direction of dreams, particularly your work as a scholar of the dream state. And I know you've also been exploring the function and operation of dreams amidst pandemic. Dreams are so accessible, intimate, and unique in the way we tend to them. So to begin, I'd like to ask you how you approach this liminal space as a place of respite and communication. Why do you dream?
It's a great question. I've always been kind of obsessed with not only my dream life, but also just the fact that we dream at all. And the mind is so complex that, we have this double life that we live that we're not always fully aware of. And there are things that we can't do with our mind while we're awake, or things that we can't face while we're awake that we can only face in our dreams. I'm fascinated by the fact that we dream at all. And I think dreaming has a particular place in these times, and particularly, life in quarantine and life during a pandemic. We're seeing a kind of resurgence in interest in dreams. I think a lot of people are experiencing more vivid dreams because of the anxiety-inducing nature of the pandemic, but also our lives have been altered such that there's more space to dream in some ways. I mean, if I don't have to bolt up in the morning and run out of my house to do my daily commute, then I might linger in the dream state a little bit longer and actually let the dreams reverberate and think about them throughout the day more than I would if I was turning my attention to something else. So for me, I see dreams as kind of a bottomless source of creativity. Whenever I'm creatively stuck, I just kind of turn to my dreams and I let the dreams guide me, even if they're difficult, disturbing, or unsettling dreams. I am interested in just listening to what dreams have to tell me and listening to my dreams for insights about where I want to go. I have a practice of documenting my dreams immediately upon waking, and it's taken many different forms. I occasionally record my dreams using the memo app in my phone. I keep a dream journal, and sometimes I write down dreams in my notes app on my phone. And then I go back to my dreams and I try to work with them in my poetry. So yesterday I just finished a batch of edits on a book that I have coming out on Nightboat Books in January 2021. And this book is all poetry that is based on dreams. And so dreams are the raw material for my poetry and my poetic practice. But I also think that dreams are not just deeply personal and significant on a personal level, but I do think we index everything that's happening in society in our dream lives. So I think about recurring dreams that I've had about ecological apocalypse, dreams that I've had where I'm trying to figure out why humans are so slow to react to impending ecological collapse. I have dreams of white supremacists being called to rise up by people like Alex Jones, dreams where there's something that I notice and I'm worried about when I'm awake, but I might not sit with that fear or worry long enough while I'm awake to, let it actually shift my attention. So I often find myself worrying about the rise of fascism in my dream life. And then I wake up, I'm like, oh, I think I'm picking up on something that's deeply disturbing that I see happening around me. So I think that is happening on a collective level around the world right now in relation to coronavirus, but also in relationship to other things that are happening in the world, geopolitics, environmental disaster, and the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jackie, I'd like to close with the recognition of how carceral logic bleeds onto every facet of our society. It often feels as if we are forever holding conversations on decarceration and abolition, trying to convince people to care through accounts of vulnerability. But your work shows the profound impacts that the building up of and normalizing of this infrastructure holds, as well as the historical truths behind it. So as we close, I wonder if you can share why it is a problem to continue to frame the carceral state as an issue of personal responsibility, or some of the problems with our reliance on the concepts of innocence, low risk, high risk, and what it means for our future should we continue to blindly invest in a system that tries its hardest to break and consume people, that takes away time. How do we break the economic and psychological logic of prisons? What will happen should we continue to co-invest in a world where state-administered harm is justified?
I think your question really demands that we be social visionaries. When we think about the prison system, it's so normalized, and punishment itself as a way to address harm is so normalized. As you said earlier, prisons aren't actually designed to reduce harm in society. It actually increases harm. It harms people who sometimes may have perpetuated harm, and sometimes there are social reasons why they've perpetuated that harm. A lot of people who have been traumatized can traumatize other people, and it perpetuates a cycle of harm rather than breaking the cycle by trying to support and nurture people. And when there's something that's happened in a community, when there's actually harm that's been done, the way that we deal with it now is by banishing those people, but most of them come back to society and they're worn down and broken by the system. It doesn't help the community. It doesn't help anyone, this system. So I think the emphasis needs to be on thinking about how to break these cycles, thinking about systems and community infrastructure that actually nurtures and nourishes people and their needs. Think about other forms of accountability besides punishment, because punishment doesn't ultimately help anyone. And to also think about the need to try to not make these distinctions between innocent and guilty, because those distinctions can ultimately strengthen the system overall. And in many cases, the people who are marked as undeserving, as guilty, as high risk, as perpetrators of so-called violent crime, they might actually be subjected to forms of racial discrimination that people who are accused of committing lower level crimes are subjected to. So, we think of the system as deeply discriminatory and biased, but for some reason that analysis flies out the window when the language of violent versus nonviolent offender enters the equation. So the trap that we're at risk of falling into is actually expanding and strengthening the system by increasing punitivity for the people who are considered undeserving and decreasing punitivity for the people who are considered deserving, which in our contemporary discourse is nonviolent drug offenders, the person who is caught with a small amount of weed and got a lengthy sentence because of 3-strike laws that criminalize drug possession, for example. I don't think it's productive to bifurcate people in those ways. I think we need to address the problem of the system overall. And I think transformative justice and other forms of community accountability and methods of folding people back into communities are important and a very important piece of addressing that issue.
Jackie, thank you so much for your work, your dedication to informing people about this extremely harmful system that we're in certain ways indirectly supporting. So I really appreciate the time you spent with us today. And yeah, thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of For the Wild podcast. I'm audio producer Andrew Storrs. The music you heard today was by Jackie Wang. I'd like to thank our host and founder, Ayana Young, as well as the rest of our podcast production team, Francesca Glassbell, Hannah Wilton, Carter Lou McElroy, Chris Hudson, Erica Eckram, and Melanie Younger.
If you'd like to stay up to date with our projects and offerings, subscribe to our newsletter by visiting forthewild.world/subscribe. To make a donation to For the Wild, visit forthewild.world/donate or support us through Patreon.